Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad you can join us today. My name is Jo White. I'll be your host for this session alongside Suzanne Rogers, Joe Hockenhull, Mark Kennedy, and Abigail Johnson. Whether you're joining us from across the UK or around the world, we'd like to say a big thank you for taking the time to join us today and be here. Today's webinar is all about changing lives and advancing equine welfare through research, co-creation and action. This covers work undertaken by the team at Human Behaviour Change for Life, University of Bristol and University College Dublin, which was commissioned and funded by the RSPCA. We've got a fantastic lineup of insights, discussions and practical takeaways planned for you this evening. And before we dive in, we just have a quick reminder that feel free as we go through this evening to put any thoughts, questions and reflections in the chat. And we will pick up those as we go along, but we'll also pause partway through today's session to answer some questions after we've talked about part of the work. And then we will have another Q&A session at the end. So please do feel free to interact. We want this to be an engaging session, and we've got lots of things that we want to share with you this evening. So without further ado, we want to just pick your brains first of all and do a couple of quick, two or three quick polls just to see who is out there this evening. So just a few questions that we wanted to pose to you. So I'm going to hand over to Abby, who's just going to pop those up for you to answer, and then let's have a look at what comes in. So just give that a second for people to vote. And once that's ready to share, okay, can we see the results? So it looks like most people have direct contact with horses on a regular basis with 80%. And I suspect that those who don't, maybe there's a craving, and we'll see what happens, and maybe you'll be joining the 80% as well. If we can move on to the next quick question. So this is, do you own, loan or care for an equine daily or several times a week? So this is probably going to be an answer for those who had contact. And thank you for those who are continuing to share where they're from and their interests. Now looking to the results, we've got 59%. So it's looking more sort of towards the half and half, but that's really interesting to sort of see how everyone who's involved with horses and who's actually doing that day-to-day care. If we move on to the next question, Abby, thanks. I think we'll keep this to the final question for this part of the workshop. This is a bit more to this one, which is which best describes your involvement with equines. So you work with equines directly, so in physical contact as part of your job. Do you work in connection with equines? So it's indirect, so you're not in that direct physical contact. Are you connected with equines for leisure or hobby? Or is it a combination? Is it a combination that you're working directly with them, but also you're involved for a leisure or hobby, or you're working indirectly and you're connected for a leisure or hobby? Or is it none of the above? I'll just give you a moment to answer that. We've got a few more people joining us as well. And I think we will move to the results for that. So it's a good split across in terms of people represented who are working both with and directly and indirectly. lots of combinations. And I think that also reflects a lot of the findings that we have had for this research in terms of people having lots of different roles and different connections with horses. So thank you very much for just indulging us in a little bit more research there. We love a little opportunity to ask a few questions. So we'll now move on to the session itself and just give you an outline of what we're going to be covering in this session. So if we just move on to that next slide. So first of all, a bit of context setting. So I'm going to hand over to Mark in a moment, who's going to give you a bit of background behind the research and what sort of stimulated this in the first place. We'll then move on to talk about how this was split into two phases. So first phase, phase one, looking at the methodology, some of the key findings from that, and the recommendations and next steps, before moving to phase two, which was about putting this all into practice from a point of view of developing interventions and designing some tools that we'll be sharing with you later. So I'm now going to move on to hand over to Mark, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the context and the background from the RSPCA's point of view.
Well, hello everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm Dr. Mark Kennedy, and I am Scientific and Policy Manager for Equines at RSPCA. And yes, I'm just going to give you a bit of background and introduction to the project. So many of you will know that back in the 2010s through to about 2012, the equine welfare charities in the UK were in a situation where there were many more horses falling into situations of abandonment, suffering poor welfare, than the welfare organisations could actually cope with. And at that time, we started using the term equine crisis, just this idea that more horses were falling into situations of need that welfare organisations could actually help. And it was felt at the time that the problem was because of abandonment of equids, people breeding too many horses without enough homes to go to, resulting in those animals either being abandoned or being neglected, and a situation where there was an overpopulation of equines, and many were falling into situations of poor welfare. And the term really became quite established, and there were a series of reports produced by several of the welfare charities working together that used the term horse crisis or equine crisis interchangeably just to sum up this situation. And what wasn't there, organizations were taking action and trying to deal with this situation and trying to help the equines, but it was like, a bath with the taps turned on. The welfare charities were bailing out the bath, but there were more and more horses falling into situations of poor welfare. And there hadn't been any really detailed, comprehensive research to see what the actual drivers were of this equine crisis. In other words, we were bailing out the horses, but not shutting off the taps on the bath. There hadn't really been any comprehensive research into what was causing the equine crisis. And we felt it was very important to make sure that any action taken to help these equines was evidence-based. In other words, it would actually result in a positive outcome for the horses, ponies, and donkeys themselves. Because, of course, charities, we all work with limited resources, and we want to make sure that those resources are put into evidence-based interventions that will have maximum potential for improving the welfare of the equines, resulting in fewer equines falling into situations of suffering. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the research which was commissioned in order to identify the drivers of the equine crisis, see what was causing this problem, and also to identify and produce recommendations for interventions that would be effective in addressing the equine crisis. So we'll be talking about that very, very shortly. The last thing I just wanted to say is that the research that we are presenting and the intervention tools that have been developed as a result of that research are available for any organisation to use. Our priority is to see this research and the tools used. We want to see us building a better life for equines. So please feel free to use the research, the horse sense report, which is our summary and policy report on the research, and the full research piece itself are both available on our RSPCA website, and the link for that is already in the chat. In fact, here it is indeed. So perfect timing of changing the slide, Abby. Well done. So yes, this is the link to the horse sense report. So you can look at the short or horse sense report, as it's called, which is the policy report summarising the research. And of course, you can look at the whole 275-page, very impressive piece of research which underpins it. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Suze from Human Behaviour Change for Life, who will take us through the research in phase 1 of the work.
Hi, thanks, Mark. So there was 2 things to note before we start. The first is that the context for this work was England and Wales only, as that's the area covered by the RSPCA. And second thing to note is that the work consisted of 2 phases. Phase 1, the research phase, and phase 2, a co-creation of an intervention or set of interventions. So now we're going to look at the methodology for phase 1 and take you through that in some detail. So the phase 1 was really about understanding the issue. So understanding the management, ownership, population and welfare of equines in England and Wales, but with particular reference to abandonment, neglect, overbreeding and overpopulation of equines. Now this is a huge piece of work, and the understanding part was really comprehensive, as we'll talk about in a minute, because we explored the drivers, the barriers, opportunities to change and improving equine welfare through systems thinking and a systems thinking approach. So we looked back in time, we looked at the present, and we tried to look forward in time, looking at this issue from all angles. So moving on to the approach, we used systems thinking as the key approach that we used. So just as the body is made up of several systems, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the lymph system, and more systems, all working together and impacting on each other, in the same way there's many elements of an issue, in this case, the horse crisis or horse welfare situation in the England and Wales. So we applied systems thinking to build an understanding of the equine crisis, from defining the crisis, identifying its drivers and causes, to mapping and understanding the extent, scope and makeup of the crisis. So it's a bit like using Google Maps. So where you can zoom in, you can zoom all the way out to see the planet, and then you can zoom all the way in through lots of stages right to see your front door. That's what we felt like as we zoomed in and out throughout the equestrian sector throughout this piece of research. And importantly, we've got the bug now, and we just wanted to highlight that this approach could be done for other species and issues too. It was really valuable to look at things from so many angles. So, cracking on with what the process involved in a little bit more detail. This slide shows the whole process that we used for phase 1 and phase 2, going into phase 2. Really important thing to note is that we triangulated the data. That's shown at the top by the little arrows. We were again looking at things from different sources and seeing where things aligned or when there are differences and exploring those. Kind of, I guess you could be cynical and say not believing the data until we'd seen it corroborated in different ways. So the first column shows the review stage. So we didn't just do a typical literature review, scientific literature review, but we also looked at official data and grey literature. So that was a huge undertaking, and some Google data review as well. So then the second was the research. We had data from many equine welfare organisations. We did a survey. Maybe let us know in the chat if you were involved in filling in one of those surveys in England and Wales. And we also did formal and informal interviews So you could let us know in the chat if you were involved in that way as well. We involved a huge variety of stakeholders, so not just welfare organisations, but across so much more. Every conceivable angle you can think of being involved with horses in the UK. We also did freedom of information requests, or FOI requests, and ultimately we used a sort of journalistic approach to data capture. So if we pulled on a thread of information and it kept generating more information, we pulled more until we'd got all the information we wanted and we could find. The analysis, the orange column, this was about processing the data to again look at it through different lenses. So here we were really working out how to visualize, synthesize, and conceptualize such a vast body of different types of data. It was quantitative and qualitative. The next one, modelling. We applied various human behaviour change models to look at this issue as well. So we added the exploration from that human psychology angle and lots more elements of human behaviour change science. And we made some visualizations out of those as well, which we'll share with you later in this session. So all of that data capture and data analysis and data modelling and synthesis led us to the phase 1 report. We'll keep linking in the chat and send around afterwards to everyone who's registered for this webinar. And then came the dissemination of the report, so getting it out there and moving into phase 2, which was the intervention design and testing phase, which we'll also cover later in this section. So handing back to Jo.
So as Suze highlighted, we were looking at this through a systems lens, so applying systems thinking to examining equine welfare. And as Suze has also highlighted, we needed to understand who was out there and who we should be talking to. So we looked at a stakeholder map, which will come to life in a moment, and just bear in mind that we're not expecting you to read the details on this because it's obviously very tiny, but another plug for looking at the full report. These are all these diagrams that we're about to show on the systems mapping are featured in the long full report. So the idea here is just to give you a sense of the sorts of processes that we went through, both from a point of view of informing the methodology that we undertook, but making sure that we didn't miss anybody. So we mapped out examples of locations where equines may be living, the people responsible. And again, this goes back to who's involved directly or indirectly, and therefore impacting on these equine welfare. In addition, it helped us from a point of view of focusing for the survey and the interviews to make sure that we had a cross-section going across the equine sector, and then it could inform how we then move forwards. So in terms of the mapping, the next image we'll be showing you is about looking at this through the lens of the horse's life, so from birth to death. So with this, we felt it's really important to look at the whole life journey of the horse. So when we talk about birth, we're also including that moment, those decisions that are around what happens before birth. So the decisions around breeding as well. And we're also looking at right through to after death as well, because with all of these factors, decisions that are made will impact on the welfare of these animals. So the factors regarding how what facilities are available in terms of end-of-life care, euthanasia, and then also carcass disposal, and how all of these different elements can feed back into good or bad outcomes for the horse. So there's some examples on this diagram to illustrate both decision making and influences throughout that journey, but also potential bad, positive and negative outcomes from a welfare perspective. So now moving on to the next slide, which is where we started to capture both the information that we were gleaning from that phase 1 research, so through the surveys, through the literature reviews, but also the interviews. And we're looking at this through a behaviour change lens. So we were using varying different models. So again, you can look at this in more detail in the full report. But just to give you a sense, and I'm hoping Abby can follow my conversations like we did wonderfully yesterday. So what we have here is the human drivers of the equine welfare crisis. So around the beginning, we've got how that human, the things that they're thinking, the desires they have, their wants, that then will potentially go on and influence their behaviours. Throughout that, we've also got wider society and the equine sector, what social norms are in play, what culture, how beliefs and attitudes of values are formed and what those are, and how that then feeds through into the wants, the desires. So you won't be able to see this on this at the moment, but it says, I want a pony. And I think, it's that sort of kind of feeling of actually that desire to have a pony. And how this might roll out in people's different aspects of life, whether the desire is to own a horse, ride a horse, breed, etc., and whether they have always had horses in their family, or, for example, are new to horses or have had some time away. So we were recognizing that there were so many factors that were involved in this. And this feeds through into decision making. So we're looking at how decisions are made, which may be taking someone from the intention to do some behaviors around acquiring a horse, perhaps, and making that actual behavioral action. And again, looking at how behavioral science feeds into this process, we can recognize that we may have conscious, rational decision making, or we can have emotional. And I think we can all kind of relate to that kind of emotional drive, particularly being involved with horses for many years, and how much that can pull on the heartstrings in terms of decision making sometimes. Those processes feed through, and those that decision making through to decisions around acquisition. So this is a sort of key point from a point of view of some of these drivers, some of these issues that we were looking at around overbreeding, overpopulation, abandonment and neglect, and how those decisions around acquisition to buy, to loan, to breed might feed through into that. For example, if we travel down to supply and demand, we have a situation where there may be too many or too few horses of particular desire that people are looking for. But we also have to take into account that when we're considering this, too few or too many may not actually be the result in equine welfare issues. So there are many factors, but this is one of the pull-push factors that we considered, and it was when we actually looked at the research. So moving along in terms of that acquisition, so thinking about that decision as to whether to buy, to loan. Once the horse is in our care, we're in a situation where it's decisions around owning, management, and care, and how they roll out. We use varying models to consider the sort of behavioural elements of this. So as we move to the actual behavioural action or inaction from a point of view of care and management, and how that then impacts upon equine welfare, we have used the model of COM-B. One of the reasons we use this is because it's reasonably comprehensive in terms of making sure that you account for the different factors from a human behavioral point of view, and it provides that insight as to why people are doing certain behaviors or not doing certain behaviors. So to give you a quick whistle-stop tour, capability, this is around psychological and physical capability. So if you think about this, does the person have the knowledge or skills to do that care and management that will uphold good welfare? Do they have the opportunity? So physical and social. So it might be around physical, such as the resources. Do they have the money? Do they have access to the right facilities to keep the horse in? But do they also have the social support? Do they have the friends, family, the professional support in place that they need to actually care and facilitate that care of the horse? And then the final element of motivation around whether the person is motivated to do certain behaviours, and how some of that might be related to automatic behaviour. So things that are very habitual, things we might have learnt very young in life and that have stuck. So good habits, but also bad habits, and how those things happen automatically, but also reflective. So around the sorts of conscious decision making that might might take part in terms of changing our behaviors in terms of how we look after our horses. So it might be if we're talking about significant changes in management style of care for a horse, such as turning out through the winter 24 hours rather than bringing in at night, that might take quite a rational decision-making process and rational reflective motivation to do that. So these are the sorts of things that were coming into play and that we wanted to take into account. Coupled to this, we obviously were looking at this through the lens of how this was impacting on equine welfare. So we brought into play the 5 domains model and linked that. Abby's doing a great job of keeping up with me. The 5 domains model, and we linked that to the COM-B model. So effectively what we're looking at is capability plus opportunity and motivation resulting in the behavior, but also that enabling us to understand whether it was a positive behavior, a good behavior that was going to result in good welfare, or whether it was a negative behavior that was going to result in poor welfare for that equine. And you'll see the lovely smiley faces of the horses where there's good welfare outcomes, and the sad grimace pain face of the horse where there are issues to do with negative behaviours and neglect, abandonment, cruelty, and welfare problems. The purpose behind doing this thinking was to give us that process and that deeper thought of how we could utilise the evidence that we've gleaned from doing the phase 1 research. So just going to show you a final slide around systems thinking, which I'm just going to touch on a couple of points here. I think the key thing that why we wanted to show you this slide was because of the nature of the equine welfare crisis system. So equine welfare sits within other systems. It's totally interrelated. So if you're looking at what's happening, whether it's overbreeding, overpopulation, abandonment, neglect, or indeed other driving factors, these all link into what we're doing as humans or not. So this is where the capability, opportunity, and motivation comes in. But also how this sits and interrelates to the wider systems, such as the wider equine sector systems and wider society. So there's a few things in here you'll note. Things in red, obviously, these are the negative, and the things in green, these are where things are going right. And we also have a number in blue, which are some of the factors that might be influencing things, such as what horses are used for in terms of leisure, companionship, equine sport, or social license, for example. But then we have this wider impact of society as well. So we have things like COVID, which Joe will be touching on shortly in terms of the impact of how that impacted on breeding of horses and acquisition. But we also have other areas such as the conflict around the world and how that has impacted on economics and the driving up of food prices for horses and bedding, etc. So all of this works in a system that we need to take into account when we're trying to understand what's happening in terms of equine welfare. So there's a lot more to this. I'm aware I've said this sort of pretty briefly, but we just wanted to give you this insight because we felt it's a particularly important thing to get across about this work. So I'm now going to hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Joe. So yeah, as you'll have got the hang of, it was a lot of research that went into this, and very much considering that systems element. So not just focusing on one area specifically, but looking at things across the board. So we had a lot of data, as you'd have heard from Suze, and then our next challenge was trying to squidge that all together in a way that made sense. So we viewed all the different data sources. We spent a long time trying to draw out sort of issues that were common between them, so things that were emerging from different places, as well as those like one-off random things that came out of some as like a secret interest pile. So it was quite a big job. The Miro boards were brilliant at helping us to do this, I have to say, even though I'm not a post-it note thinker by nature. So we actually pulled out a number of key findings about what the drivers for the equine crisis might be. And obviously there's a reason why the final report is 275 pages long. there was a lot of stuff to find and a lot of information generated. So we worked with the RSPCA, understandably. Not everyone wants to read 275 pages of research report. So they sort of identified 4 of the key findings that were essentially drivers causing this equine crisis to continue. We distilled those down into the horse sense report. So that's sort of like a summary report of the 4 key areas the RSPCA were keen to take forward. So we are, obviously this is part of our dissemination of our research work. We've also presented to NUC, we've spoken to equine welfare charities, we've been written up in Horse and Hound. So word is getting out, but we're super excited that, we've got this opportunity to talk to you and to share with you sort of our key findings. So I guess what I'll do, I'll just go through the 4 key drivers that we pulled out for the horse sensor report and give you some examples of the data that supported those through key quotes. Our overall conclusion was that there is an ongoing crisis, and we've reframed that as the equine welfare crisis. Essentially, this equine welfare crisis cuts across all sectors of the equine industry. So it's not just one part of it or another part of it. It affects us all. So these findings that we're presenting, and obviously the phase 2 intervention work, is relevant for every aspect of the equine industry. And I know I saw a few familiar donkey fan names. So those of us more interested in the pointy ears or longer pointy ears, these findings, it also came out for donkeys. I mean, we did highlight that there was less donkey data available, but some of these themes were also reflected in the donkey literature, and I'm very happy to talk further if anyone's interested on that. So our first driver for the equine welfare crisis was the proliferation of carers lacking in practical knowledge, skills and experience. And this is leading to an inability for people to actually provide equine welfare needs and detect and treat any welfare problems that arise. We have 2 quotes here. So one's from the survey and one's from one of our formal interviewee peoples. So the first one: it's so easy to buy a horse now without having any knowledge of how they should be kept, ridden and the costs, with the result that many horses live under appalling conditions. And then secondly, from our formal interviewee, I would say that 90% plus of anything that's come in that's been from a caring home has actually got something wrong with it that's been missed or ignored by the owner, that is. So that was quite a sad thing to see. And as these quotes sort of show, it's not intentional neglect, it's people just really not appreciating horses or donkeys for who they are and not recognizing those signs that things might not be right. The lack of practical skills and opportunities to obtain those really came out strongly around the closure of riding schools, and I know that's something that's been in equestrian social media and the press quite a lot, so that's something that did come up a lot in our report as well. So, sorry, Abby is speeding ahead. So the second driver that we found was a mismatch between the supply and demand of certain equine types. So Joe touched on this, which leads to overpopulation and low value of some equines, such as thoroughbreds, and a scarcity of others, such as leisure, sort of all-rounders, with welfare issues arising from both due to mismatch of owner skills and equine needs. This was incredibly strong, I have to say. It's worth highlighting here, as Jay said, that our research was conducted sort of 2022, 2023, while the pandemic was still quite fresh in people's minds, and we'd all seen that massive spike in horse prices, and then suddenly everyone was like, oh, I need a horse. Where do I find one? Prices went bonkers, and people started breeding sort of in anticipation of sort of carried on increased demand. So that sort of, we are aware that that would have affected some of the results we've got, but this is a theme that has carried on throughout this mismatch. So the 2 quotes here, the first one's from a formal interviewee, second from a survey respondent. So you don't want to encourage breeding because there's lots of horses out there, but are the horses of the right useful type? And the survey respondent: There is an unmet demand for medium and large-sized horses that will do no more than pleasure riding, and an oversupply of small cobs and thoroughbreds. There seemed to be a lot of people that were genuinely really struggling to get hold of a horse that would suit their ability, their size, their requirements in terms of what they were hoping to do with that horse. We certainly saw a trend for a lot of perhaps people that didn't have the skills acquiring former racehorses, purely because there's so many on the market. Often they're sort of on the cheaper end of the scale as the demand sort of increased for those weight carrying leisure horses. So again is something that's quite concerning. So the third key driver that we found was the lack of equine keeping facilities with adequate provision for turnout, grazing and socialisation, which leads to unfulfilled welfare needs and fewer opportunities for positive welfare. This was quite striking in our data. So we had, from the survey, particularly so many people with amazing intentions. They knew what their horses needed. They knew what they were trying to find in terms of places to keep them, and just could not find somewhere that would meet their horses' needs. Whether that was sort of people that were trying to rent land and not finding land available, or people trying to keep their horse at livery yards and they wanted DIY but could only find full livery. So there were real challenges out there. Many people commented on the closure of livery yards, often associated with riding schools that are closed. And so the demand was so great, many livery yards seem to have turned to overstocking, again, reducing turnout opportunities, and perhaps leading to more stabling if turnout had to be shared between such a high number of horses they couldn't all go out together. So these are two quite chunky quotes we've got from survey respondents. So to start off with, too many yards offer restricted or no turnout. Horse management is stuck in the Victorian era of working horses despite modern knowledge. Horses kept for human convenience and insufficient places suitable for equine needs, not enough space, socialisation, grazing or browsing. Factory farming approaches preferred with rows of stables, social isolation. And then second quote, good yards are hard to find or then to afford. Livery yards in this country seem to overstock themselves with horses, so there's no way that the 3 Fs can be met, with fancy stables taking precedence and few yards offering group turnout or even winter turnout. We need a change in perception on how we keep our horses. And that was very much coming up quite strongly, again, through our data. Okay, and then the last key driver for the equine crisis, and as you can imagine, this was quite a biggie. So the lack of provision for the lifetime welfare of all equines, including planning and careful decision-making, from birth to death, leading to premature euthanasia, delayed euthanasia, abandonment, or poor end-of-life care. And this point really speaks to the way that horses are viewed by many people. So there was that real sense of contrast in our data. So some people spoke about the commodification of horses, typically in other people, where horses were seen as a tool or only bought for a certain purpose or for a certain use, and sort of really spoke up to that lack of people keeping horses for life anymore. We saw this very highly reflected in some of the other data we collected, such as the online sales adverts, when there was a noticeable increase in the number of old or sort of geriatric horses that were advertised very cheaply for sale or even free to good home. They couldn't be ridden. They wanted, their owner wanted somewhere for their retirement. So these horses were essentially being passed on to new homes, which has obvious welfare concerns there. We had a lot of comments around the sentience of horses and people acknowledging that and recognising that horses were sentient, but perhaps failing to treat them as sentient. And that's where makes a really significant impact on their welfare. The decision-making around euthanasia was particularly hard. Again, at the time the survey was done, it was in the cost of living crisis. Following the pandemic, we had a lot of discussion around the cost of euthanasia and sort of feedback people were getting from their peers on livery yards, for example, on what type of euthanasia was appropriate in different situations and carcass disposal and that side of things. So again, it's quite a political but emotive decision to make. So these are 2 quotes. The first one's from a survey respondent. I feel like more people these days are likely to sell due to their equine not being fit for purpose anymore, rather than keeping them for life. And our formal interviewee, I know several local riders, they go through horses every 6 months. So they'll buy a horse, they'll post on Facebook about how wonderful it is. They've done this dressage test and they've done this and the other. Then they'll fall off the horse. And then the horse will be for sale 3 months later. And then they'll buy another horse. And then the next thing. So there are people that are sort of serial horse buyers, but not horse keepers. And that really speaks to that move away from people really taking that lifetime responsibility for the horses in their care. So, Suze.
So now looking towards solutions. So before we get to phase 2, I'm just going to talk about the recommendations that came out of the research. So throughout the process of the research, everyone we talked to, from the surveys to the interviews and the resources too, all provided lots of suggestions and recommendations and ideas for what could be done to make things better for horses. So all of these recommendations were taken, which is quite an undertaking in itself, and clustered into themes, which you can see here, 5 themes. And then for each theme, we listed the emerging solutions from the research. We added some context from our team, and then we listed, so for example, if some ideas didn't correspond to what the research findings were, so we added some context, and then we listed recommendations for the sector. Again, this is all in the full report. Of these, just 2 key ideas were taken forward into phase 2 of the research of the work with the RSPCA. So we just wanted to briefly outline the others. And of course, the reason why we're doing this is to hope some of these ideas whet your appetite for ways that you could all be involved and take things forward. So policy and process, this theme of recommendations. Recommendations in this theme were around supporting the legislation we already have, for example, by supporting magistrates to use the Animal Welfare Act more in order to create more legal precedents that can then lead to further use of the Act. Also, there were recommendations about the need to consider how the equine sector as a whole can enforce or facilitate enforcement of current schemes and legislation. There were also key recommendations about potential introduction of new specific schemes addressing various elements of the problems identified in the research, sort of livery yards and so on. And there were recommendations for how to develop specific definitions for certain elements, for example, indiscriminate breeding, to ensure that policy discussions are all aligned, talking about the same thing. So there's more to it, but that's a brief, in a nutshell, summary of some of the recommendations in that policy and process theme. Theme 2, education and training. So here there was a recommendation to map education and training needs across all sectors of the equestrian society, business and leisure, that involve horses, and also look at what available courses there are currently and how they address the needs and therefore identify the gaps. And what we did some of this work, we continued this into phase 2, and we'll cover it when we talked about phase 2. We did some of that mapping. Theme 3 was working with others. This was super strong, again, a really strong theme. Recommendations to identify key projects requiring a collaborative approach and to develop strategic approaches as appropriate. So this is things like how to encourage subsections of equestrians to find common ground with those focused on improving welfare and to make pledges for improvement. Recommendations to encourage better collaboration between not only the welfare organisations and the wider equestrian sector, but also with the commercial sector to address where products on the market do not always correspond to providing what horses would benefit from. If horses could order from a horse catalogue, what would they choose? And we thought maybe not a huge amount. So societal approaches was another big theme. Recommendations about the recognition of the changing role of the horse or equines in society. So before outward-facing activities to address those harmful societal norms can be considered, before we look outward, we felt that the sector itself needs to look inward, to actively pledge to adopt certain actions kind of ourselves within those key players and key stakeholders. So, for example, the media, the veterinary community, professionals, and all other stakeholders which should be adopting policies and recognising horses as sentient beings and talk about them as such. So, for example, by not using the word it when referring to horses, he or she or the horse. We had lots more examples. And so before highlighting the need for horses to be kept in a certain way, charities, colleges, veterinary hospitals, similar establishments should be making sure that they're keeping the horse in that way, the way that protects their welfare. Also, given the rise of social media, there was a lot of suggestions about it being logical for the sector to work on a multi-stakeholder campaign regarding prioritised issues to address the fact that a lot of harmful practices are completely normal in the horse world and completely accepted. There were lots of examples and recommendations about this regarding all those things we typically think of normal in horsekeeping, but really are harming their welfare or not safeguarding their welfare. Another key area of theme from the recommendations was further research. There's always more. However much you do, you just find there's more. It's like grooming a dog. As more and more hair comes up, and that's what we felt like as we did this research. There were recommendations to identify and prioritise top issues and work on them further, and also acknowledgement that the relevant stakeholders need to be an integral part of the process through funding initiatives, supporting initiatives, driving them forward, and so on. We really felt there was something for everyone in this work and from these recommendations. So whoever you are, whoever you represent, go and have a look in the document, because there'll be something for you. Now we're going to take a pause and go to some questions, because before we go to the interventions, we just wanted to have a look at some of the feedback you've been giving in the chat. And we wanted to, again, highlight at this point that a lot of this work and this approach is relevant to whatever species you work on or country you live in. So we wondered if you'd like to share in the chat, and I'll facilitate the discussion, inviting the panelists to answer any questions or reflections, share any reflections, what resonates so far, are you surprised by any of the findings, and perhaps even what aligns with your concerns or might be a call to action for you of anything you want to take forwards. So let's have a look what's coming through. It's coming back to you. So we will pick out some key things. Comments like this is wonderful. And I like lots of comments of people wanting to get their paws on the full report and just zipping around a bit, stalling. Some points about cognitive dissonance. That's really key. While I'm looking for some sort of key questions, I like the yes, no more it's. That's something that we feel strongly about too. I'm sure that some of the other panelists have been looking through the chat while I was just going through the recommendations. So Joe Hockenall or Joe White or Mark, do you want to hop in for a second while we find some other questions?
I think just one of the things I wanted to emphasise is that, it's so important that we have the evidence now to support our interventions going forward, and to ensure that we can prioritise the causes of the equine welfare situation. It's really important that with limited resources, we have the evidence to support what we're doing. So going forward, we're very strongly evidence-based. So that's a great position to be in, and it's fantastic. We've got this research to underpin us going forward. And just to reiterate, really, the whole idea is this research is to be used by all. Obviously, we are taking some things forward as the RSPCA, but we can't do it alone. We want to work with other organisations, with other individuals, to build a better life for horses. So just a reminder, this is collaborative work, and we want to move forward collaboratively.
Thanks for that, Mark. Yes, there's a lot of reflections coming through, appreciating the depth of the research. And of course, it can always be deeper, but it was a systematic review. So I think that's being appreciated. And also there's some recognition that it's relevant for other countries. So there's Monica in Canada comments on that as well. And then Lorna from Heartbreed suggests, makes a very pertinent comment. So Joe Hockenall, can you see that one?
I wasn't going for the Lornas. I would love some research funding to appear from somewhere, and that's partly, if anyone has some who's watching this is one of our calls for help. We'd love some more funding to be able to carry this on. I actually unmuted because I saw the comment on licensing, and that actually came out strongly. Quite a few people, both the interviews and in the survey, were should we start licensing? Again, the survey was, I think it was just after France had introduced their license for keeping horses, so it was quite something that was quite fresh in people's minds. And there was a bit of variation, some people wanting to license horse ownership, but other people wanting to just license stallion ownership to try and get around the breeding side of it as well. So there was talk about licenses, but in different ways, which we found quite interesting. Oh, no, Dan's chipping in.
Brilliant.
I don't know if Mark, did you want to quickly say something? The question about why the term crisis was it justified, and where that came from?
Yes, that's no problem at all. So that term crisis started being used pretty informally, really, in the early 2010s. And it was coming from the welfare organisations themselves who were feeling in a situation of crisis. Many, many more horses out there. We were estimating how many horses were in situations of suffering and neglect, and finding thousands. 7,000-8,000, I think, was the estimate at the time. There were about 2,000 in all equine welfare organisation care at the time. So we felt there were many, many horses that were in situations where they were needing help than the equine welfare charities ever could. And that's why the term crisis was used at the time. Now, according to the study we're reporting on here, we find that crisis has somewhat eased, and it's gone from a situation of lots of horses in, very, very apparent situations of suffering and neglect to a wider equine welfare situation or crisis where we have horses suffering across all areas of society. And that's one of the reasons why we're moving away from talking about a horse crisis or an equine crisis, because the situation we find ourselves in now is different. Horses not having their welfare needs met, right from just across all sectors of equine society, whether it's people keeping horses in their backyards or on farms, right up to top level competition horses. We see a wide range of horses not having their equine welfare needs met. That's why the emphasis now is on equine welfare, rather than just talking about an equine crisis in terms of numbers of animals.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark, and your cat. We will be able to revisit some of these at the end, hopefully. Without further ado, we really want to get to talking about the intervention stage or phase 2. So I hand over back to Joe White.
So we'll move on to the next slide. So yes, we're moving from phase 1, which was all about understanding what was happening, to phase 2, which is about change and impact. So following our submission of the 275 pages phase 1 report, the RSPCA considered where they wanted to go next in relation to using those insights to decide on the priorities for phase 2, because what we were looking at was then looking at intervention design. So they came up with 2 interlinked focus areas, which were selected from the recommendations that Susan's already touched upon, which were around sentience, so equines to be treated as sentient beings, and also around skills, so equine keepers trained to ensure good equine welfare, including advocating for development of equine-friendly training for people keeping equines. So Very much you can see that these are interlinked in nature, and sitting around this idea of how we can treat equines as sentient and having those practical skills to do so. So we're now going to take you through a little bit more information about how we approached phase 2. So the methodology used, we incorporated both a combination of the science that we gleaned from phase 1, but we also utilised and drew upon more sort of a creative approach as well. So we used co-creation, working with people from across the stakeholders within the equine sector. And we also use design thinking. So those who've ever had a bit of look at design thinking, you'll recognise some of these titles. But this helped us to go through an effective process of developing the intervention. So the first phase of this was around understand and discover. So developing a deeper understanding of the problem, empathizing. And through this, we went back to phase 1 because we like to use our data properly, and now go and had another look. But we looked at this time through the lens of, so particularly through the lens of sentience and skills development. So we looked at the literature, but we also reanalyzed the raw data from the surveys and the interviews. We also love a bit more new data, so we looked at the latest literature that had come out since that first phase to see if there's anything that was relevant to what we were now exploring. And we also undertook further interviews. So we undertook another 22 interviews from people across the equine sector to try and get as much input as we possibly could. So again, we're just building on the layers. We started the process of co-production with a number of different stakeholder groups. We had 7 in total. So those were made up of different stakeholders. So we had them from the equine welfare sector, equine membership organisations, college, as in FE colleges. We also had involvement from veterinary and farriery. And also equine researchers in those scopes of those co-creation groups. All of that was utilised to make sure that we really got to grips with what we were considering. So we're now moving forwards into the define element of this process, where we're using the understanding to define the scope of the problem. So when we're talking about what is sentience, what does treated as sentient look like? And what skills are needed to enable treated as sentient? These were the sorts of questions that we posed through different means within the co-creation sessions. And again, because we love to be geeky, we put it through the lens of behavioural science. So as we were going through, we were analysing what we were getting back from those who were involved in the co-creation sessions. This information then moves towards into what's called ideate, where you generate ideas and creative solutions. So we had 2 sessions with our co-creation groups. The first was around this sort of defining and really making sure we'd understood the problem properly. And then the next was around kind of developing those ideas for solutions. So drawing out, again, through behavioural science and frameworks, looking at how these mapped across to get creative ideas to move forwards. Ultimately, we were looking then to develop a prototype. So what was going to actually enable people to treat equines as sentient? How were we going to advocate for equine-friendly skills and training? Because there was a lot of information that came out in terms of both the barriers and opportunities for doing this. Susie's going to cover in a moment some of the tools that came out of that prototyping. But the final element of this process was around testing and learning. And this was a critical element of how we made sure that what we had actually developed was actually going to work in reality. So the beauty of co-creation is that you get the lived experience from those who are involved, but also it's having that ability to also test it. So we had those who were involved in the co-creation, plus, as we like to get more people involved, we had others as well in terms of the stakeholders involved in testing and learning, with the idea that we could keep innovating. So we had colleges, universities, equestrian centres, and more professionals from across the sector, and also horse owners and donkey owners, I'm sure. So right across the sector, so we could really learn and evolve. And I think an important point of this is you'll note that the arrows feed back and feed forwards. So it's an evolving process, and we would really advocate that it continues to evolve as things are going to change. So it's something that can be built upon. So now we'll kind of move forwards. Just another couple of points about co-creation. What really came out of this process, but also has come out as other work that we've done on co-creation, is how powerful it is. So to involve people who have lived experience, who have direct expertise of working with horses, working with different parts of the sector, was very, very powerful. But also the process of co-creation itself and the reflections that came back from those who were involved, it was very clear that it was an intervention in its own right. So this enabled a lot of deeper reflection about the situation. So it's certainly something that offers a lot of opportunity in its own right as an intervention. So I'm going to hand back to Suze, I think, now.
Yep. So we'll cover each of the resources that we developed in the next part of the talk. But this diagram is just a map to show how they link together. And all of these will be available on request. So these aren't available online yet because we're still in the testing stage and working things out. But if you get in touch with us, we can share them. So level 1, the small green circle at in the bottom left. This is a one-sheet resource for people directly involved with horses to encourage them to create a habit. We tested that, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. Level 2, the next stage up, was a kind of interactive booklet outlining some content and sort of encouraging diary keeping. We'll talk about that one in a minute. And alongside of this, there was an interactive tool, a kind of app type thing, which has the beauty of providing data. So how exciting is that? You can get data back again about how people are making changes. And also at this level, there's a resource library to signpost people to what we consider ethical, appropriate resources. And that's a living document, so we can add to that as well, as are all of these. Level 3, the next green stage. First of all, we have a guide to imagery and language for societal change, and also the document we affectionately called the Big Beast, which is a guide, quite a hefty guide, for people and organisations who are in a position to drive change. Also at this level, there sat some case studies about our kind of writing up how people are using these already in the test version. The final bit, the next level, the orange big part of the map, this included the project report for the RSPCA, a kind of behind the scenes look with the reasoning, data, etc. that underpins these resources, and also a skills analysis and mapping document, which you mentioned earlier, and then also quite a few supplementary documents as well. The orange lozenges down the side show the process for how these tools can be used. So first of all, the launch of the toolkit, and so change makers can engage with the resources and start at level 3 and then engage users or people they come across as relevant to them at levels 1 and 2. So that's just a quick, we'll go through in a tiny bit more detail. So next, first up, we're talking about the skills map element. So the picture's just for illustration. We appreciate you can't read it at this size. It's just to show another example of how this kind of mapping process worked. So bridging the skills gap. Working with equines at any level requires a solid foundation of practical skills, competence, knowledge, applied understanding to ensure that we're maintaining equine welfare and also keeping humans and horses and equines safe. However, the research found that despite this requirement, there's a lack of skills in doing the behaviours that are needed to treat equines as sentient, and this contributes to welfare compromise. So in this document, we outline our approach to skills analysis, really consider the difference between skills and knowledge and the process of skills development. And then the key themes that emerge from the research are described together with outlining the skills that are needed for each of those to happen. And the skills gaps are then identified and discussed. And a tool, we love a tool, at this point is provided that could be used to monitor skills gaps and changes as the sector develops. And finally, recommendations to those working in the sector to drive change in this regard to bridging the skills gap are also outlined. So this is available on request. A little bit of feedback we had from one of the testers was that it was paradigm changing. So now heading back to Joe White.
So this was the level 1 tool. So what we wanted to create was something nice and simple. So effectively, it's a plan on a page. So we called this the happy horse habits. We haven't quite come up with a rhyme for donkeys, but if anyone has, that's always good as well. But this very much does relate both to horses and donkeys. And indeed, this tool could be used for other species as well, including just creating our own habits. So what we effectively did, we built this on behavioral science and the work undertaken with the co-creation groups. And it's made up of 4 phases. So the initial element is around introducing the concept of happy horse habits and introducing the fact that we do habits in everything we do around routine care of horses. So we're doing a lot of things on repeat, day in, day out. So it's really ripe ground from an animal welfare point of view to be able to build positive habits and positive behaviors. And the joy of habits is that they're sustainable. They're more powerful than intention. So once they're in place and they're positive habits, there's something that's going to really impact on equine welfare in a good way. This is another area where, on the second part of this, around the use of the 3 Fs, the reason we put this in here was we wanted to have that nudge factor to remind people of the key welfare elements that they needed to consider when they were picking those behaviors, picking those tiny habits that they wanted to focus on. So this was the nod to the 3 Fs to keep people aware of that. Then we move on to the planning element in regard to developing their plan to do their habits. And again, it's about making it as easy as possible. So you'll notice that we have taken the late great Michael Mosley's concept of just one thing and really focused in on that, because actually if people can just get something tiny and start the process, they can build the confidence to do more. And the beauty of this plan is around the idea of using existing habits. So you link an existing new behavior to an existing habit, which again is based upon lots of evidence around habit formation. So the likes of BJ Fogg and Charles Duhigg have done lots of work in this area. So it's a very simple thing of developing a plan where when I put, for example, a head collar on my horse, so this is something that they might be doing as a regular habit, something you do on a day-to-day basis, you don't really think about it. So that's ripe for connecting another behavior to it. I will give him a good scratch. So that's the behavior they might want to introduce so that we both enjoy a positive moment together. So this is the reward. So what we've got effectively is this loop going on from the cue, so the existing habit, to the routine, the new behavior, to the reward, that emotional feedback that we both want to see. Obviously, it depends on what reward works best for the person, but this gives them the flexibility to identify and test what sorts of rewards work for them. Ultimately, we're setting up that craving so that the behavior continues, but it's been done in a way that people are fully aware of what's going on and they're planning it and they've got that ownership. We also had a few tips about things like putting reminders in place as well, just to kind of help people along the way. The fourth element of this is around a pledge wall. So this is an idea that we think could work really nicely. So this could be run through social media, or it could be run at a yard. So there's lots of different opportunities, or indeed it could just be run at home on the kitchen fridge. So putting up your pledge wall. So it's a means of getting that kind of affirmation, but also that social support from others. And also that the evidence around pledging and doing that publicly, that people are more likely to continue with the behaviours. So again, everything we've done here is based in behavioural science. The feedback we had was, I like the fact it's personal change between that user and the horse. Simple and quick, but effective. So that's what we were looking for, something that was really easy. I kept reflecting on the power of just one thing. So that really resonated with someone. And it's straight to the point and very easy to put into practice. So this is what we were looking for, is something that's accessible. It's accessible for the individual, but it's also something that can be used by the professional. So the professional who's working with others and helping support them to develop new behaviours. So moving on to level 2, which is very much connected with level 1. So this is the happy horse tool. So effectively what we've got here is a bit more of a deeper dive into what we're looking at in the happy horse habit. So it's a more supportive approach. So with this, what we did is we have a number of areas that dig a bit deeper. So for example, the 3 Fs, it starts to explain the sorts of things that people could consider. It provides some supportive suggestions around how to actually apply this. So it gives examples throughout and case studies so that people can start to select what sorts of habits and what sorts of behaviors might work and how they can put them in place. Because sometimes I think it's a human nature thing that we tend to look at the big messy problem rather than breaking it down into bite-sized amounts. So this level 2 supports the person to do that and go through the process. It's all about starting small. Our experience is that people can overcomplicate it. So by doing this and going through this level 2 process, it will help them to break it down. It gives examples. It also gives examples about how to identify the right sort of anchor behaviors, those ones they want to use to attach to, and how they can identify those effectively. It talks about setting up the right contextual cues so that you're more likely to have success, and how to identify the right sorts of means of getting your reward and celebrating, and how important that is. Another area that's important within this tool is the fact that it tells you how to deal with some of the challenges. This is often where people fall back or relapse in terms of their behaviors. So actually what this covers is strategies for success. So how you can start to think about, okay, what might happen, where might things go off the rails, and actually how can I plan ahead so I can keep myself on track. It also covers some social support, so where people might look for that, how people can set that up, just to kind of help people along the way. It talks about monitoring progress and how to do that effectively, so you again get that feedback. And throughout this, what it's doing is building this growth mindset, which is something that came out of the phase 2 research and work, and also out of phase 1, was the importance of having and embracing a growth mindset. So the feedback we've had here is I can see this working really well with our students, even just by going through the process of breaking down the steps and thinking about each way marker separately. So, and we've had some really good feedback as well of that being used in colleges. We also always tell ourselves off before, because we revert automatically to patting rather than scratching in some situations. This gives us a strategy to combat this shortfall. So it's all that kind of having a means in place to kind of reset. And sometimes that's it. It's also being kind to yourself, but being able to reset. And then finally, another example was there's an approach for everyone. So riding clubs, colleges, riding schools, leisure owners, and professionals. So again, this is a tool that can be used by the individual. It can be used by professionals, organizations, and by people working with other people to deliver change. So there's lots of potential here. So I'll hand back to Suze to talk about a couple of the others.
So level 3, so this is the rather hefty manual or guide for organisational change. So it's a guide for people and organisations to take those people they interact with through the process of change at all levels, from individuals through to society. And so through the stages shown in this diagram, from raising awareness, and incidentally, we've grown to prefer the term sparking curiosity, because we always think, well, if you raise awareness, what are they going to do about it? What does that really mean? But sparking curiosity, the term sparking curiosity kind of shows that it's the beginning of something. And if interest is piqued, and then people are more likely to seek further information and so on. So from the first stage of raising awareness or sparking curiosity and people who are involved with horses, all the way through to sustained change and influencing others and more. So this is a comprehensive document, which means it's long and detailed, but there's still much more that could be included, as always. There's lots of human behaviour change science in there too. And some feedback quotes on this when we tested it are included here. So one person said, I honestly think it's just so powerful and thought-provoking. It could work for other areas such as parenting, dog care, and much, much more. And someone else said, it's ambitious, thoughtful and thought out, well-researched, practical, great potential to create positive change in the horse world, and hope this becomes a go-to research across the sector. So those are just some examples of the testing, of feedback we had in the testing phase. The next slide is the Changemaker Toolkit. So from the co-creation sessions, from the interviews and other sources of information, a recurring concern was the perception of equines in society. So, I mean, regarding imagery, for hundreds of years, if not longer, horses have been depicted in art, statues, and so on, with a body language of being anxious, worried, and fearful. I mean, just think of carousel horses, imagery in magazines, on TV, toys, and much more. And also think of the language we use. We've already said, horses are often referred to as it. So with this in mind, we created this resource which covers content all the way from the importance of understanding framing and why it's important to think about these things, and through to messaging principles, language and imagery guidelines. So what to show or say and what not to show or say to depict the horse in the way that we feel would encourage society to be kinder to horses. It includes how to craft messaging, and also things like what channels of communication there are, and much, much more. So some screenshots of some of the pages are shown here, and you're not expected to read them at that size. It's just to give a taster. And a quote from the feedback was, this offers a whole new world of positive, enabling, affirming communication. So again, this is another resource that people can take, develop more, and so on. So over to Jo again.
Cool. Yes. Right. So hopefully you're all still with us after a very whistle-stop tour of the phase 1 research and the phase 2 interventions. I guess so. Firstly, we wanted to say a really big thank you. So thank you for your interest. Thank you again to everyone that's participated in phase 1, phase 2, or both of those. We couldn't have done it without your help. So what's next? As we sort of alluded to earlier, this is in part a bit of a sales pitch. We're super keen to see this research being taken up by others, being used for different projects, different kinds of interventions. And we're really keen to be part of taking it forward as well. So yes, any kind of, anyone's got some spare change and wants to fund anything, get in touch. As we sort of alluded to, in the 275-page report, there is a lot of work that can be built on some project suggestions and different ways forward. So very happy to answer any questions around any of that if you'd like to get in touch. And I guess just sort of putting my donkey hat on. Obviously, phase 2 interventions, the toolkits are very relevant to donkeys as well as horses, but we did really flag up that lack of donkey data in the phase 1 research, and that's certainly something I'm hoping to address through my role at the Donkey Sanctuary now. But I guess I'm just leaving you with our final plea. So please do use what we've created. We are super happy to talk to anybody about it, and in reality, as you can probably guess, you'd have problems shutting us up once you get us talking about it. We've got so many potential projects we'd like to do, as you can imagine. Super happy to share ideas, super happy to talk to you about your ideas of taking it forward, because we need to work together as a sector, as an industry, as an army of horse and donkey fans. We need to collaborate. We've got the evidence now, as Mark said, and we've got some momentum, or at least we're building some. So this is really a time for us all to pull together and to help our equids, whatever length of ears, live a good life. So over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Jo and colleagues, Suzanne and Jo Hockenhull, for the presentation from Human Behaviour Change for Life there on this fantastic work. So just to summarise, really, I think what we have here is we've got a paradigm shift. Our evidence based upon the work which Human Behaviour Change for Life have done, together with these tools we've got forward, will hopefully drive a real paradigm shift in how we work with horses and help us really strengthen our relationship with them and ensure that they have a good life. I mean, we know, all of us who are involved with horses know how absolutely life enhancing they are, and being involved with horses is life enhancing, and how much fun we can have together. And given everything they give to us, it's only right that we ensure that they have a good life with us going forward. So the entire equine welfare sector, we would want to use this research, work on the evidence that we're providing about the equine welfare situation, and the breadth with which equine welfare needs are not being met, to address that, to use the research, to use the tools to address the root causes of the situation. And, just recapping a little bit what I said at the beginning is, back in the 2010s, we were dealing with a situation of a repeating equine crisis, with horses falling into situations of poor welfare, suffering, neglect, and abandonment. And based on the evidence that we now have with this horse crisis work, or with this the horse sense work, and the evidence that HBCL have created for us with the fantastic piece of research I've presented, let's go from a situation of dealing with crisis to taking preventative action to make sure that these situations don't develop in the first place. So, this research, the tools that are being presented here, are the very first steps in this collaborative mission. We all want to work together to build a good life for horses. So, obviously the RSPCA can't do it all on our own. Human Behaviour Change for Life, we can't all do it on their own. We all need to work together to drive a good life for horses. That's really important.
So as we draw to the end of this evening, we want to say a massive thank you to all of you as well for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts, your questions, your reflections, and also to thank those of you who have helped us on this journey as well, because there's a lot of you who have taken part in elements of this work through answering surveys, undertaking interviews, being part of the team, because the team is much wider than us here today. So thank you all for what you've done to make this possible. We are, as we've highlighted, really keen that this goes forwards and has the impact that it should and can have. So I suppose the key thing here, just to kind of finish with, is we did have another little poll. I don't know if Abby's kind of got that poised. I think it's question number 6, which would be fantastic just to sort of ask people, just as we're sort of finishing off. A few little questions there, just as we finish. But thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you have any further questions about any of this, we've got a few minutes left. We can also take those, so pop anything in the chat. But do follow up with us. There's the email address there for the RSPCA, and you can also contact me. I will share that all with the team that's here tonight and the wider team at HBCL and University Bristol and University College Dublin. So I'm hoping that we just give people a few minutes to add anything regarding next steps that they might want to. That would be fantastic. And if you have any questions, do add anything on the chat. I'm going on the basis that Abby, who is the woman with many tasks, will magically reveal it when she thinks we've got a good number of them. I think some of the points that have come up in the chat this evening as well, we will follow up on. So apologies if we haven't answered kind of all of the points, all of the questions. They were flying along at speed. So we're looking forward to going back over those and we'll follow up in an email with anything that looks like it hasn't been answered this evening. So do rest assured we'll take note of what you've shared. So something looks like it's coming from Abby. So yes, it's 95%. That's fantastic. Want to collaborate. That's brilliant. And in terms of actions, this is where I need to try and view the details, see what comes up. Excitement, because I haven't done this before. So I've got my L plates on with the, so we've got, oh, lots of lovely, I don't know, Abby, if you can you share the word cloud?
Unfortunately, I can't see that part.
Okay. What we'll do is, unless I can magically share it myself, we will send that in an email after. But there's a little word cloud that's come out of that, which we'll follow up in an email. So that's the kind of temptation to keep talking to us, is you get the word cloud when you get the email. So we, as we will often say, we like to behavior change everything. We like to be geeky about it. So we've given a little treat there. You can have a word cloud of what was shared. But unless there's any other questions, we'd just like to say a big thank you and good evening, or have a lovely day if you're in a different time zone, and look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Lovely to see so many of you from so many different places and involvement with horses online.